The longing for connection appears to be embedded in neural cells in the chest around the heart, making sense of things like heartaches and broken hearts. In autism, emotional contagion develops through resonance, that is, they actually catch the emotional energy of others, resonating with them, and experiencing the same physical sensations through their bodies. Such experiences can be termed as emotional hypersensitivity and accounted for by the intense Wald syndrome, which indicates that the amygdala and related emotional areas of the brains of autistic individuals are affected with hyperreactivity, leading to hyperperception, hyperattention, and hypermemory. My entire nervous system is intensely sensitive, such that my emotions and senses vibrate at a frequency different than most. For instance, I was unusually sensitive as a child, extremely emotional. Autistic adults are more likely to experience high levels of loneliness than their neurotypical peers. While 7% of the general adult U.S. population meets the diagnostic criteria for social anxiety, 1 in 4 autistic adults do. Autistic people are also 4 times more likely to suffer from depression and 11 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, problems that frequently both stem from the exacerbate social isolation, and they are 2.5 times as likely to die early. Despite the serious setbacks that many people on the spectrum face due to living in a society that discriminates against those who are different, social anxiety, loneliness, and lack of connection are not inevitable parts of being autistic. Many people also reported lasting healing with regard to trauma and social anxiety. Given Danforth's dissertation findings and Walker's real-world experience, they proposed that MAPS pursue a study trying to address something that autistic people themselves tend to identify as a problem, and that MDMA seemed to have a high likelihood of being able to help with. Social anxiety. While social anxiety isn't an intrinsic aspect of autism, Walker emphasized, it is something a lot of autistic people have because they have a lifelong history of social rejection. This is a great article that was just shared on Tim Ferriss's blog. I have watched quite a few interviews and they are highly interesting. What we always hear is that the setting is the most important thing when working with substances. Setting is the physical, social, and cultural environment in which the experience takes place. Many years of research tell us that the single most important ingredient in effective therapy, regardless of the paradigm, is the empathic capacity of the therapist, especially in trauma therapy. Right-hemisphere processing is holistic and non-linear, taking everything in at once, in a receptive way. Working with the right hemisphere is the bedrock of healing in therapy.
Is it a particular type of presence that you're attempting to foster, say, in yourself, Bonnie? Is it kind of, more of a right brain presence than a left brain presence?
Yeah, this is where Iain McGilchrist's work comes in. And Iain talks about the two hemispheres of the brain in a nutshell, which is hard to do because his book is this thick. The master and his emissary. I got to interview him once, and he said, if anybody handed me a book this thick, I'd say, it's too big to read. I'm not going to read it. But it's really worth every moment we invest in it. But he talks about how the two hemispheres of the brain don't do separate things, but they see the world differently. So the right hemisphere is all about relationship. So when you talk about a right hemisphere presence, yes, that presence that is without judgment, without agenda, and is devoted to what's happening in the relationship in this moment.
The right hemisphere gives sustained, broad, open vigilance, alertness, a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, never perfectly known.
That's the presence that brings safety, and that's what makes room for vulnerability. And then the person's system begins to offer up what next needs healing.
I'd say the world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The left hemisphere gives narrow, sharply focused attention to detail. And people who lose their right hemispheres have a pathological narrowing of the window of attention.
But the left hemisphere is also really important because the left hemisphere is the place where we could have a lot of knowledge about how this is what I think it was my left hemisphere that lit up when I heard Dan speak that first time, because it's like he was giving me some beautiful knowledge about what's actually happening. And if we can understand how this beautiful nervous system works, it gives us like a solid platform to stand on, so that then we can open into this presence that's just receptive and open and caring. And then that gives us the ability to respond. If we're truly deeply listening, we'll find a response begins to arise. So it's very much of a right hemisphere, but supported by the left. He calls the right hemisphere the master, Iain does, and the left hemisphere the emissary, and that the emissary is essential to stabilizing the master so that he or she can focus on what's actually happening in the moment.
For what's happening in our times. Over the last many years, you've spoken to how we've really swung really left brain.
Yeah, I know. When I was in my getting my master's as a marriage and family therapist, there was still more space, it seemed, for kind of a depth approach, and one that rested on this kind of profound connection. Carl Rogers wasn't so far away that we'd forgotten him, which we seem to have a lot now. But over the years, as I think the whole world and our culture, our Western cultures anyway, have gotten more and more concretized into the left hemisphere, there has been this movement toward what are the protocols, what are the interventions, and a more what we call evidence-based therapy and cognitive behavioral ways of dealing with people and helping people. And all of that has pulled us away from depth and pulled us as clinicians into the role of being the expert that knows how to fix people. And what I've learned through interpersonal neurobiology, as well as my own experience, but really foundational, is that the wisdom of healing is in the client. It's not in us. And when we try to come in as the expert and try to, imagine, like, we see people through the lens of diagnosis, which puts everybody in a box. It's like, oh, you have anxiety, you go in this box, and I should do these things in order to help your anxiety be relieved. When we begin to do that, the individuality of the person gets washed away, and the sense of us being kind of in this together in a way that I can support you and you can show me what it is you need. Nobody is just an anxiety disorder. We don't treat disorders, really. We treat humans.
And then the magic thing that happened, it was a really interesting thing. It was a word change that before it was even called the DSM, in between the first and second, or the second and third edition, they took out the word. These are used to describe reactive disorders of mind and behavior. And they took out the word reactive. So in other words, people were suddenly being made into, you are sick and it's not a response to your world and the things you are experiencing in your world. It was put inside the person.
Right.
And to me, that was like, talk about language signifying, one word was eliminated.
Could you give us a definition of trauma from an IPNB?
Yeah, we can really talk about that because so often we hear trauma talked about as though it's overwhelming events. And what research is beginning to show us is that that is not quite accurate. Yes, an overwhelming event as our system perceives it to be, but the nature of the overwhelm is often because there's nobody with us to help us hold it. So we talk about trauma as potential traumas when something that's scary or hurtful happens to us. And then if we have the people around us, or we've internalized people within us so that we can integrate the experience, it never becomes an embedded trauma. But if we don't have that, then that trauma will embed as though it's being held, carefully held, until there's help that can help us to integrate it. So our system actually knows how to bring that trauma into the subcortical and the body and hold it there so it's not in conscious awareness all the time. So I've come to think about trauma not so much as what happens to us, but who's with us before, during, and after an experience that allows us to be able to literally integrate that into our system, or if not, then to hold it for a later time of integration. Those can be very small things. I often think of kids in preschool that have these little small pools of trauma. Maybe they're shamed during the day, or they see things that scare them, and there's no one there that can really attend to each individual child. And so that child maybe comes home and then falls apart at home. And if the parent sends them away or doesn't comfort them, then that's going to embed as this little pool of trauma that nobody's here to help me. Nobody really cares about me enough to help me with the upset inside of me. But if the parent instead can gather that child onto his or her lap and let that child process that through, then that child's able to integrate it and go on without taking in this sense of no one will help me. So it's even small things that can be overwhelming for us. There's so many pressures on us every day that we can't process through all the way. So we're all accumulating these experiences. And there's some amazing research about the importance of this before, during, and after, of having people with us, and that's really what sets the stage for whether traumas really stay with us and will have to be worked with later or not.
The consequence of trauma is kind of a lack of empathic witness.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a witness to the experience.
Yes, either on the outside, or if we've had the wonderful experience of having people be with us through our lives pretty regularly, we often have built an inner community that is able to help hold us as well. I know I can just think about 2 or 3 people with whom I'm particularly close, and I feel my system settle. Mm-hmm. And I know that even if something out in the world has scared me or, hurt me in some way, that I can be in their presence, and that also helps. So it isn't only what's outside, but also what we've internalized and can really call on in times that are, very challenging for us.